Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples Integrated Recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice and sugarcoating, no platitudes or bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Well, if you have been listening for a minute, I'm now like 40-something episodes recorded, and a lot of the same topics keep coming up, usually from different angles or different approaches. And so a few times I think I have circled the topic of forgiveness and how that relates to anger, betrayal, how it affects the nervous system, all sorts of things like that. And so today I'm going to talk more on forgiveness because it's something that comes up frequently in sessions with clients, especially with a handful of the people that I work with who are in addiction recovery and are active in 12-step circles where sometimes forgiveness type language is forced too quickly. And in a 12-step approach, forgiveness is sometimes treated as a requirement instead of an outcome. And in some contexts, forgiveness shows up as something that you're expected to arrive at once you have done the work. Like you make amends and then you admit your wrongs and you let go, move on. There's an implied sense that if you're still angry, you're stuck or you're resisting or you're doing it wrong. And then what gets missed is the layer underneath. Forgiveness is often prescribed before the nervous system has really processed what happened. People are told that they have to forgive their parents or their partners, institutions, or themselves while their body is still living in threat mode. The result is usually a surface compliance with unresolved activation underneath, that you're saying the words and your physiology disagrees. That's where the question came from: why does forgiveness feel so emphasized in spiritual systems, and why does that emphasis so often backfire? Why does it feel like pressure instead of relief? So this makes me think about a lot of areas of my life that have needed healing, and other people being very quick to say, you need to just get over that. But you can't get over a wound that has not been witnessed or had time to digest. And so the problem is not forgiveness itself. The problem is sometimes the frameworks that we wrap around it. So this episode is about forgiveness. Specifically the ways that sometimes it is performative or premature or even harmful when it's treated as a moral obligation instead of a psychological outcome. And it's about the different approach that centers understanding, causation, and responsibility rather than debt and absolution. Now, whether we are aware or not, many of us in Western culture inherit a very specific model of forgiveness that comes from a Judeo-Christian moral structure that frames wrongdoing in the language of debt. Someone harmed you, a moral imbalance occurred, justice demands repayment, or mercy cancels that balance. And we hear it everywhere. Or we even say it, like, you owe me an apology. I can't forgive what you did. I'm still paying for that. And even outside of religion, the structure stays intact, that there is a ledger. Someone's in the red. Someone else decides whether the balance gets cleared. If we were to look at Christianity, that is the whole thing is wrapped around sin has created a debt, and that the only way to be free of that is through mercy and through the relationship with God and Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So whether we want to say that it's framed around religion, I think it's kind of arguable. Like, justice demands repayment, but mercy arrives if a third party steps in and pays the debt, and then now the creditor is satisfied, the debtor is relieved, and a new relationship is formed. And this isn't theology, it's talking about psychology that teaches that forgiveness requires a transaction, that someone has to absorb the cost, or someone must release the claim, and that power sits outside of the person who was harmed. And I have learned that this is where trouble starts. Because when forgiveness is built on debt language, then relationships can turn transactional. Emotional pain becomes something that is supposed to be discharged on command. Unresolved anger starts to look like a moral failure or a spiritual immaturity, and that's certainly how it might be framed in 12-step contexts. And so you see this in recovery spaces. People will hear things like resentment will kill you, it's the number one offender, and that forgiveness is for your own good. And those statements are not wrong in a narrow sense, but they can become damaging if they skip internal mechanics. If resentment is treated as a choice rather than a nervous system state that is the result of a wound, then people learn to suppress it instead of understand it. One article I wrote, the author pointed out that debt framing strips relationships of empathy, because once someone becomes a debtor, then the relationship collapses into you owe me or I'm owed, and context disappears, history disappears, fear, shame, developmental trauma, and survival strategies disappear, and then what remains is moral arithmetic. Another anthropologist observed that debt language has long been used to justify relationships built on harm because it reframes suffering in a way that makes the injured person seem unreasonable for holding on to it. And that observation lands hard when you look at how often people are told to forgive something without being understood. This is why forgiveness can feel awful if it is forced, because it just becomes another demand, another obligation, another way to fail at being healed. And in programs like AA, forgiveness often enters through the language of amends and moral inventory, and there is value there. Naming harm matters, taking responsibility is important, and making repairs matters. But the problem shows up when forgiveness is treated as an end point instead of the byproduct of doing deeper work. When people are pushed toward forgiving others or themselves before they understand their own reactive patterns, then forgiveness turns into a spiritual bypassing, and it becomes a way to avoid grief, anger, fear, or shame. And a lot of people who are in recovery have already carried a lifetime of suppressed emotion. They learned to override their internal signals. So asking them to forgive on command reinforces an old pattern that fed addiction in the first place. To be disconnected from the body, comply with these rules, silence the truth. And forgiveness that skips understanding does not resolve resentment, it just buries it. And then buried resentment is likely to leak out later as depression, irritability, self-sabotage, or relapse. And then people say something to the extent of, I thought I forgave that, but it keeps coming back. And that is because you never finished processing. Your nervous system doesn't respond to moral instruction. It responds to safety, clarity, and integration. And until the system understands what happened, why it reacted the way it did, then forgiveness is just conceptual. This is why some people feel worse when they are trying to forgive, because they're trying to force an internal state that hasn't been earned through understanding. And some of this language in 12-step programs says, let it go. But the body says something still feels dangerous. And that kind of tension can turn into self-blame, or people can conclude that forgiveness doesn't work or that something is wrong with them. And neither of those conclusions is accurate. The starting point that I want to use here moves away from forgiveness as a moral achievement and towards something that is more concrete. That is causation. What happened? What conditions were in place? What internal patterns got activated? What reactions followed in the mind and body? This approach doesn't ask whether someone deserves forgiveness. It asks why the system reacted the way that it did and why that reaction keeps repeating. There is no outside force stepping in to balance anything, no moral ledger to clear. Responsibility stays local, and the work stays inside the person who is suffering. From this angle, forgiveness stops being the goal, and it just becomes a side effect of doing your own internal work. Because when the nervous system no longer needs to defend against a threat narrative, the emotional charge drains. Peace shows up as a byproduct of clarity, not a reward for doing what your sponsor told you to do or doing the right thing. And to make sense of this, it also helps to understand cause and effect in a very practical way, stripped out of that spiritual abstraction. I have found that Buddhist practice fills in lots of little cracks and gaps where parts have been missing in my recovery or in my spiritual journey. And when Buddhism talks about the concept of karma, it is pointing toward momentum. What gets repeated gains force. What gains force becomes automatic. And automatic reactions feel personal, justified, and permanent, even if they started as just a survival response. This matters for forgiveness because resentment is not just a thought. It's a state of activation. The body stays mobilized. Your attention is locked on a threat, and memory keeps replaying the injury to justify staying ready. There's a specific pattern here that needs to be named, and it is the impulse to get even. The drive to restore balance with retaliation, whether that is external or internal. That drive can look like anger, contempt, withdrawal, rumination, or a constant mental case that's being made against somebody else. And you don't need religious language to recognize this. Everyone knows what it feels like to replay an offense in their head and then to feel that in their body. And that loop keeps your nervous system in a fight or flight mode, and as long as that loop is running, peace is not accessible. What forgiveness does, when it works, is it interrupts that loop. You stop rewriting the past, and it isn't excusing harm, it is stopping forward motion of retaliation. The system no longer needs to stay mobilized because it's no longer rehearsing an ongoing threat. This is why forgiveness that is forced doesn't work, because you can say the words while your body is still preparing for battle, and then the loop remains intact. But understanding is what breaks the loop. Understanding does not mean intellectual explanation. It means seeing enough of the causal chain that the nervous system no longer reads the situation as active danger. When you understand what drove someone's behavior, in a lot of cases, the body stands down, not because behavior is acceptable, but because it's not a mystery anymore, and the predictability is what restores safety. clarity reduces your vigilance. This is why insight can dissolve resentment faster than willpower ever could. Willpower tries to suppress activation, but insight removes the reason for activation. And in that sense, forgiveness is not a command. It is a ceasefire that comes from inside the system. The body stops scanning, your attention can loosen, and energy that was tied up in defense mode becomes available again. That is the peace that people are actually looking for when they talk about forgiveness. They just want the activation to stop. They want that constant readiness to relax, and they want to feel settled again. When retaliatory activation ends, several things happen that people notice pretty immediately. Your sleep improves because your mind isn't rehearsing the arguments or replaying it. Your muscle tension drops because the body is not braced for impact. Intrusive memories can lose some intensity because they're no longer being fed by you. And reactivity in unrelated situations decreases because the system isn't already overloaded. This is regulation. That is not anything about moral spirituality. It's just a physiological regulation. And forgiveness framed this way becomes practical. It is the decision to stop adding fuel to a loop that is already costing you. It's the refusal to keep your body in a state of readiness for a fight that might never even take place. And that decision doesn't require liking what happened or thinking that it was God's will. It doesn't require reconciliation. It doesn't require forgetting. It requires clarity about what continuing this loop is doing to you. So, going backwards, why this changes the entire conversation. When forgiveness is framed as an obligation, people can resist it because it feels like self-betrayal. And when it's framed as de-escalation, people get curious because it offers relief. The question then shifts from, should I forgive, to what is keeping my system activated? And it shifts from, how do I let this go, to what am I still reacting to? And when you shift from what they owe me to what is this costing me, then it puts agency back where it belongs, which is inside the person who is suffering. Betrayal is where I think that all of this gets tested the hardest. And it's where people feel the strongest pull to either try to force forgiveness or they cling to their anger. And so I'm going to move into understanding that loop and what can lead to change that lasts, that forgiveness or forced forgiveness may not give people. Betrayal is where all of this gets tested the most. It's easy to talk about forgiveness and understanding abstractly, but betrayal drags the body into it. And the nervous system does exactly what it is designed to do. It starts to scan, remember, and to prepare. And I've been through significant betrayal from people that I either cared about or that really mattered to me. And when I would talk about this with confidants, a sponsor or parent or whatever, forgiveness often shows up as this expectation from the outside or from the cultural waters that we swam in, that I need to forgive so that I could heal, forgive so that you can move on, forgive so that this relationship can survive. And there have been times that I've tried doing that, or tried to say the words or tried to mean them at the time. I can remember one time that I had learned about a pretty significant betrayal, and I was just in the middle of it. And I went to an AA meeting, and it was a speaker meeting. And after this speaker meeting, my sponsor had asked me, my thoughts on it, and I was still in the height of finding out that my partner that I had been with at the time was like sexually inappropriately texting with somebody. And my sponsor told me, like, so you missed everything because you were self-absorbed, huh? This is like something that is sometimes wrong in these 12-step programs, is there's not enough processing and there is too much premature, you're in the wrong, do more service, poor you, self-pity. And I understand all of those concepts maybe if someone is stuck there like years down the road, but when something's active and something's on fire, you can't just slap a forgiveness spiritual bypassing on everything. So use this just recent example I just gave you. You can't forgive your way out of something that is still an activated threat. And if you are stuck in unresolved threat, that's not being self-absorbed. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it is designed to do. So I don't think that any of this work can be rushed. But something else that can be part of this is a retaliatory drive, a specific internal drive that keeps resentment alive, this urge to settle a score. I'm certainly guilty of this all the time, that my brain will go into these really unhealthy score settling rather than solving a problem. To restore balance by making sure that the other side pays in some sort of way. That payment does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it's withdrawal or moral superiority, internal arguments, or keeping the file open on somebody. And this drive keeps your nervous system mobilized. As long as the system thinks that there is unfinished business, it stays alert, the memory keeps getting replayed, your attention keeps circling the injury, and the body stays prepared. From a functional perspective, that makes sense. If a threat is still active, staying ready is adaptive. It's the smart thing to do. The problem is that for many of us, the threat is no longer present, even though the body keeps treating it as current. And forgiveness that is forced or imposed does not resolve this. The retaliatory drive doesn't respond to moral instruction or being told that you're self-absorbed. It responds to clarity and safety. So the shift happens when you can stop asking how to forgive and instead start asking how things happened. This goes back to causation, because now we're removing self-blame, but a causal way. And when I started examining choices that were made, pressures that were involved, avoidance patterns, fears, and blind spots, now we're looking at conditions that made these choices predictable. And if you follow the chain back far enough, then some of it might even start to feel a little bit less personal. That doesn't remove pain, but it changes the meaning of pain, because the event stops reading as an attack and starts reading as an output of a system that is under strain. And then when that happens, the body can start to stand down. What dissolved wasn't memory, it was the need to keep rehearsing the injury, that the loop eventually loses charge because it no longer serves as a protective function. And at that point, forgiveness is irrelevant because there's nothing left to resolve. The system has integrated whatever it needed to integrate. I'm going to move into why understanding lasts when forgiveness sometimes doesn't. Forgiveness that is declared can be undone by a next trigger. But understanding that reaches the nervous system reorganizes how memory is stored. When understanding is sufficient, then memory remains factual instead of activating. It no longer carries the same physiological punch, and then the body doesn't react as if it's happening again. This is a reason that people might say something like, I don't feel angry anymore, but I didn't really forgive either. I'm just kind of indifferent. And what they might be noticing is that the retaliatory drive has shut down. The ceasefire is already in place. That is the endpoint that people are seeking, right? Relief, settling, space. Forgiveness is not letting someone off the hook or losing leverage. What takes strength is ending the internal war, ending the vigilance, ending the identity built around being wronged. And that strength comes from clarity, from seeing mechanics cleanly enough that the system no longer needs to stay mobilized. That is a form of self-command, not moral compliance. Holding onto resentment feels powerful in the moment because it gives shape to pain. Letting it dissolve requires tolerating ambiguity and loss of narrative certainty, and that is harder. It demands more capacity. This approach does not tell you to forgive. It doesn't tell you to reconcile. It doesn't tell you to forget. It invites you to understand what is keeping your nervous system activated and whether continuing that activation is still serving you. So the questions shift. What reaction am I rehearsing? What outcome am I still waiting for? What would happen if my body no longer treated this as unfinished? Those questions move the work out of ideology and into real experience. There's one more piece that is worth naming. People who point out our blind spots often activate this same loop, that we react defensively, attacked, or that we prepare to counter. A quote that was attributed to Buddha was that a wise critic should be treated like someone pointing out a hidden treasure. That idea lands differently when you see feedback as information instead of an accusation. When someone close to you names a pattern that you don't want to see, the initial surge of reactivity is familiar. The opportunity lies in staying with that surge long enough to understand it. Why this matters. Everyone has been hurt. Everyone has hurt someone else, sometimes knowingly, often unknowingly. The question is not whether forgiveness is good or bad. The question is, what actually ends suffering? Because forcing forgiveness adds another layer of pressure, but understanding removes the need for pressure altogether. When the system understands enough, the retaliatory drive ends. And then when that drive ends, peace follows naturally. No declaration required. If there is an invitation here, it is simple. When the word forgiveness shows up, pause. Ask what your body is doing. Ask what it's preparing for. Ask what understanding hasn't landed yet. And that's where the work is. That is where things actually change. Thanks for listening. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have, and we are all capable of growing past them. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.